Chapter 243. The Brave Molen 3. Eugene was going to fight with Molen. He was going to fight and he was going to win. Though there's no way that's possible, Eugene admitted to himself. From the very beginning, Eugene didn't really think he had any possibility of winning. Even if he poured out all that he had into this fight, his chances of victory would be slim, so it would be far too arrogant of Eugene to believe that he might be able to seize victory when fighting Molen without any weapons. As for ignition, I don't really want to use it. But depending on the circumstances, it should be fine. Winning this fight wasn't all that important. Molen might disagree with him, but at least that was what Eugene thought. In fact, if he had the opportunity, Eugene really did want to fight with Molen and win. It wasn't like he hadn't had such thoughts in his previous life when he was still Hamel. Just like how Molen had wanted to fight with Hamel, Hamel had also wanted to fight with Molen. However, so many things had changed since then. Hamel had become Eugene, and Molen had stayed alive over these past 300 years. All that time had worn out Molen's spirit, but his barbarically limitless strength must have reached new heights. As for Eugene, he currently had unlimited potential. However, that potential had yet to fully bloom. According to Eugene's own estimation, if he gave it his all, he felt like he wouldn't be any weaker than he was in his previous life. If one just looked at all the options he had in combat, he had a lot more in his repertoire than what he had had in his previous life. However, Eugene couldn't really evaluate himself as being indisputably stronger than he was in his past life. In those days at his peak, Hamel might not have had a diverse range of abilities, but when it came to killing his enemies, Hamel was as efficient as a Grim Reaper. Also, even if the peak Hamel was present today, he wouldn't be able to defeat the current Molen. Hamel, Molen said. He looked at Eugene with eyes that betrayed his confusion. He didn't know why Eugene was insisting on a fight all of a sudden. What would change if they did fight? Nothing would change. Perhaps Hamel thought that after defeating Molen in a fight, he would be able to make Molen listen to him. Since I've won, obey my orders. When it came to Hamel, such words and actions really suited him. However, wouldn't that only work if Hamel actually won? Was he so excited that he couldn't grasp the difference between their strengths? There's no meaning in doing this, Molen tried to persuade him. You and I. Eugene refused to keep listening until Molen was finished speaking. Instead, he pulled a kasha out of his cloak. Then, since he had decided not to use a weapon, he also took off his cloak and threw it behind him. As Sir Eugene, a voice called out. Mare, who had finally gotten used to the miasma on this side, belatedly stuck her head out of the cloak. Similar to Molen, Mare was also having trouble understanding why this was happening. She wriggled her body out from beneath the cloak in order to climb out, only to hesitate, not having completely gotten over her fears. She had only been able to adapt to the extent that she didn't lose consciousness, and even that was only possible because more than half of her body was still hidden within the cloak of darkness's subspace. She was afraid that if she came out like this, her existence as a familiar would be corrupted by that ominous aura. Just leave those fools alone, Anise said as she picked up the cloak. After glancing down at Mare, who was poking her head out of a gap in the cloak, Anise threw the cloak over her own shoulders. Whoosh! Anise's divine power transformed into light and enveloped her whole body. It was only then that Mare felt secure. Mare stammered, "Thank you. There's no need for that. Mare, you and I are both having a hard time because of these fools," Anise said sympathetically. "Aren't you going to stop Sir Eugene, Lady Anise? It's not just you. Christina keeps asking me the same thing. Why aren't I stopping them already? But those fools won't listen to me even if I do tell them to stop. Since they won't listen to my words, I'd have to step in between them if I wanted to make them stop. But why should I do such an exhausting thing?" Anise asked as her face crumpled into a scowl. "Just leave those two idiots alone. They don't listen to people when they talk. Because fools like them have their own foolish ways of sorting things out." Mare hesitated, "But what if?" "I know what you're worried about," Anise nodded. "However, Mare, just who do you think I am? Even if those two get into a reckless fight, I can heal them as long as they don't die. That idiot Hamel should be taking that into account while picking a fight like this. That's why I'm so annoyed. Because in the end, aren't they still counting on me to provide a miracle for the fools that they are? Sister, if you hate the thought of that so much, wouldn't it be better for you to step forward now and mediate between the two?" Christina prompted. Anise thought back. "Silly Christina. As I thought, you only have a shallow grasp of this situation. If you leave them alone, Hamel will end up half-crippled and in need of a miracle from me. Don't you want to be able to look down at a Hamel who's as weak as he can be? Don't you want to see him being healed by the miracle that you've called upon? These thoughts were so shady that it was hard to believe that a saintess had even thought of them. As such, Christina was left shocked, yet she just couldn't answer no to the questions that Anise sent flying at her. Sister. When the time comes, please switch places with me, Christina eventually requested. Don't worry about it. Christina, you should be sure to remember. It's not just moments like these. Both of us have to make sure that we share any enjoyable situations that come up fairly between us, Anise replied to her. The bond between Christina and Anise thus grew even deeper. While this conversation was going on behind the scenes, Eugene prepared to activate the formula for his signature that he had built up within Akasha. This was a signature that had been created with the help of several of Aratha's arch-wizards. It was still incomplete, but that didn't mean there was too much of a delay when it came to casting it. In a confrontation between wizards, speed was more important than the scale, power, or sophistication of their magic. The signature that was known to be the fastest of them all was the Pantheon of the Red Tower Master Lovelian, the man who happened to be Eugene's master in magic. As Lovelian's student, it was guaranteed that the speed of Eugene's signature wouldn't be low. The immense magical formula of Eugene's signature, which was characteristic of all great spells, wasn't just being built up within Akasha. The purpose of Eugene's ring flame formula wasn't merely to explosively accelerate his mana output. Its original foundation was based on Sienna's eternal whole, and Eugene had simply replaced the circles of the circle magic formula with the stars from the white flame formula. The ring flame formula that was created in this fashion still retained the ability to record spell formulas like the eternal whole did, and this made it possible for him to cast most spells without any incantations. After he had reached the sixth star of the white flame formula, Eugene's stars wouldn't stop spinning. The white flame formula had been completely integrated into the ring flame formula and evolved. The stars in his heart began to brighten. The starlight resonated with Akasha. His signature's formula was shared between Akasha and his ring flame formula, because it was necessary to imprint the spell itself onto Eugene. Thanks to that, this spell didn't require any incantations. Just by making Akasha resonate with the ring flame formula, Eugene could immediately cast the spell. Whoosh! Purple flame rose from Eugene's left shoulder blade. The flickering trail of flames appeared to create a fiery wing. The single wing of purple flames rose higher and higher before spreading wide open. Hamel, what in the world is that? Molen asked in surprise, without even backing away as he saw this single wing of flames spreading out from behind Eugene. He had lived for hundreds of years, but he was still virtually a stranger to magic. However, he could still tell that the spell Eugene was currently casting was unusual. At first glance, that wing seemed to be made of flames, but the heat he felt from them wasn't as high as the heat coming from a real flame. Instead, Molen sensed an indescribably vast yet complex mass of mana. Though not sensed, he saw it. Even with Molen's shining eyes, it was impossible for him to read the true form of this spell, but he could still see that the flames that made up Eugene's wings contained a huge amount of mana that was arranged in a sophisticated pattern. Prominence, Eugene called out. Though he hadn't meant to say it when Molen asked that question, Eugene still answered him with a curt expression. At this reply, Molen blinked his eyes, then let out a loud laugh. What a wonderful name. From this flame, Molen felt something similar to what he had felt from Vermouth 300 years ago. At that time, the white flame formula didn't even have a name, but the pure white flames summoned by Vermouth were just as huge and bright as Eugene's were. Although Molen also had a vast quantity of mana, it still couldn't compare to the amount held within Vermouth's flames. Apart from Vermouth, Molen also sensed something similar to the Hamel from 300 years ago. Hamel's mana hadn't been as massive or intense as Vermouth's flames. However, Hamel's mana had been so complex that there weren't any openings for Molen to see through, so Molen couldn't even begin to imitate it. The moment that he had this thought, the fogginess inside of Molen's head cleared a little. Molen took off the fur pelt that was draped over his shoulders. Then he threw it behind him just like Eugene had. Hamel, I truly don't want to fight with you, Molen repeated as his muscles began to writhe. Badump, badump, badump. His muscles swelled as if they had been pumped full of air, and the already massive frame of Molen's body slowly began to grow even larger. Molen continued speaking, however, You must have a reason to want to fight with me. I don't know what that might be, but I do know one thing. This was the brave Molen. With his hair wildly twisting in the wind, he looked down at Eugene. His eyes didn't look as dull and tired as they did before. Eugene saw a bright light shining within Molen's pupils. Hamel, you can't beat me, Molen declared. We'll just have to see about that, Eugene replied with a smile. Embers began to spread from the flames on his back. With each flap of the wing, feathers flew into the sky. If you have the confidence to beat me, Eugene began saying as he unbuttoned his sleeves. In fact, there wasn't any point in unbuttoning even a single button on his clothes. There was a good chance that before long, all of his clothes would be turned into rags. Then don't dodge or block this blow of mine and let it hit you, Eugene finished his challenge. It was obviously a shameless statement. But Molen's reaction was unexpected. Fine, Molen readily agreed. Well, Molen was just that type of guy. Molen spread his arms and left his chest wide open in a challenge of his own. While glaring at Molen's face, Eugene clenched his fist. Purple flames engulfed Eugene's body. Now that things had finally reached this step, Eugene wouldn't take this opportunity lightly. Molen had agreed that he wouldn't block or dodge the first blow. If so, this blow would probably be the biggest and last chance for Eugene. Even if Eugene managed to beat Molen and knock him down, he knew that wouldn't solve the problem. However, Eugene still wanted to defeat Molen if at all possible. Was it because he wanted to prove that Hamel had been stronger than Molen? No, that wasn't the problem. It was he just didn't like the excuses given by his friend, who had gotten worn down and tired after living for hundreds of years. No matter how much someone tried not to change, people still changed little by little. If they had lived for hundreds of years, they were bound to have changed even more. However, Molen hadn't accepted that fact. As the brave Molen, he didn't want to show the comrades that he had reunited with what he looked like after breaking down over these past hundreds of years. Eugene really didn't like that. In fact, he hated it. That was why he wanted to beat up Molen. Because Molen had, of his own accord, taken on the request that the son of bitch Vermouth had given him and made it his mission in life, then proceeded to fight those mysterious monsters in this hellish place until he finally broke down and collapsed. Eugene's foot kicked off the ground. He accelerated with all his might, and his fist was so packed full of strength that sparks of mana were overflowing from it. This was far too strong a force to use against a human being who had promised not to dodge or block the blow. However, Eugene didn't hesitate. His opponent wasn't weak enough to be called a human. This was Molen Roar. There was no way that Eugene didn't know just how tough and strong that idiot was. Even so, Eugene thought to himself cautiously. Just in case, he considered where exactly to hit so that he could finish this fight in a single blow. The heart. Eugene didn't have the confidence that he would be able to penetrate those thick chest muscles. So it had to be the head. Or should he aim for the shin? Or else, should Eugene honestly try to plant his fist in the center of Molen's face? No. Eugene decided to just hit Molen where he wanted to hit him. As he swung his fist through the air with all his might, he punched Molen in the cheek. But it didn't feel even remotely like he had just hit a person. Eugene had pushed his fist forward with all his strength, but Molen's head hadn't turned even slightly. Naturally, there wasn't even the sound of his cheekbones being crushed. Fizzle. The sound followed belatedly. The flames around his fist that couldn't break Molen's body scattered into the air. You absolute fucking monster, Eugene silently thought as he immediately blasted up his mana. A series of explosions engulfed Molen's body. Using the recoil from the explosion, Eugene threw himself backward. Didn't you say it would just be one hit, Hamel? Molen asked, standing tall in the center of the flames. His black hair fluttered in the wind and a light shone from his wide-open eyes. Whoosh. With a single shake of his head, Molen was able to completely scatter all of the flames covering his body. Boom. Molen began walking forward. His muscles still writhing, his right arm rose from his side. His thick fingers curled up to form a fist. That was all that he did, but in Eugene's eyes, Molen became the center of his entire world. Apart from Molen, he couldn't see anything else. That was just how immense Molen's current presence was. You can dodge if you want, Molen said. If this was the usual Eugene, once he had heard such words, he would instead choose not to dodge it. Because his pride wouldn't allow him to obey. However, currently, Eugene couldn't even imagine entertaining such pride. If he tried to block it, he would be crushed along with his defenses. so he had no choice but to try and dodge it. But how, where to, and at what moment? All of Eugene's thoughts were occupied with these concerns. Molen threw his fist forward. Like Eugene's intuition had told him, the force behind that fist was unparalleled. Eugene shuddered as he sensed the immense strength crushing its way toward him. Boom! The force of the blow swept over the ground. It didn't just end there. Without weakening even slightly, the shockwave pierced through the air and completely annihilated the mountain peak that fell into its path. If he's hit by that, he'll die. Christina screamed. However, Anise just let out a snort and grumbled. Still, it seems like Molen hasn't completely lost his mind. Mare stammered. What do you mean by that? Sir Molen just tried to kill Sir Eugene. If he wanted to kill Eugene, then he would have swung his fist even harder than that, Anise corrected her. If he couldn't even dodge a fist that's being held back, then Hamel would just be an idiot. A mountain peak had been erased with just one punch, but that was just Molen holding back? Unable to comprehend it, Mare just stared up at where the mountain peak had vanished. To her shock, after she blinked a few times, she found that the mountain peak that had unmistakably vanished moments before had now suddenly reappeared, looking perfectly intact. This wasn't reality but instead, a separate space created by Vermouth's magic. Molen had yet to lower his outstretched fist. He tilted his head to the side as if confused. Eugene hadn't been swept away by the force of his fist. He had successfully managed to dodge. However, Molen couldn't tell just how Eugene had managed to dodge it. Had he moved his body? But if that was the case, there was no way that Molen would have missed it. Was it magic? Eugene had said that he was going to use it. Molen was also aware of what kind of spell Blink was. So right before Eugene could have been swept away by the punch, had he managed to get away using Blink? It's strange, Molen thought as he retracted his outstretched fist. Molen couldn't see anything in front of him. However, he could detect something. Hamel's presence was continuously on the move within this wide space. Yet his speed was so fast and his movement so complex that Molen was completely incapable of grasping his position. Each of the feathers generated by Prominence could be used as a spatial coordinate to reposition Eugene. Thanks to that, Blink's requirements for vision and spatial coordinates were no longer necessary. Even the spatial distortion, which could be seen at the moment of blinking, was hidden by the flames of mana that erupted from the feathers. The wider the space, the more Prominence's jump-off points increased in number. An exponential increase to boot. And that wasn't all. The fluttering feathers would continue to drift, so Eugene's opponents couldn't predict the jumping-off points used. Prominence created an infinitely intricate path for attacking Eugene's opponents. But Eugene's eyes were strained and his head was throbbing. This couldn't be helped. Currently, Eugene's mind was linked to each of the countless feathers. Thanks to that, Eugene was able to spy on Molen from any direction. Even from behind Molen's back, he could see Molen's front. Unlike seeing something with one's own two eyes, the information was directly engraved into Eugene's head. It wasn't simply seeing how Molen's body was moving. He could see how the mana itself moved and reached. Molen's barbaric and immense strength suddenly went into motion. He had given up on pursuing or predicting Eugene. In the first place, that wasn't Molen's specialty, nor was it his preference. He didn't know where Eugene might reappear. He didn't know when the attack might be coming. So what if he didn't? Molen could just sweep it all away. Molen raised both of his fists into the air. Realizing what he was about to do, Anise's expression twisted into a grimace and she pursed her lips. Then a barrier of dazzling light was summoned to protect Anise. Molen's raised fists fell to the ground. At that moment, Eugene was in the sky a short distance away. The feathers that had flown there were acting as stepping stones for Eugene. As Molen's fists smashed the ground, the sheer force created an explosion. The shock waves swept across the ground and surged into the air. By doing this, Molen could cover a massive area whatever was within reach of his strength. In the middle of this gigantic storm, Prominence's feathers floated about as if they would be swept away at any moment. However, they never really disappeared. Getting rid of all the feathers was an obvious strategy for dealing with Prominence, so Eugene had prepared for that right from the conception phase of his signature's design. Yet seeing how strong the shockwaves were, it would be difficult to keep this up for very long. It would be enough if they could just hold on for a little longer. The countless feathers were moving according to Eugene's will. Right before the shockwaves soaring into the sky could reach Eugene, The feathers made up of embers began burning intensely. These purple flames then clumped together. Through this, a sun that seemed to have been dyed black was born. This was eclipse. Once again Molan wasn't able to understand what had happened to him. He had slammed his fists down and set off an explosion. Up until that point Molan had been in control, but the sunspot that had appeared within this makeshift arena was out of his control. It was small. A very small black spot. So with that size, what the hell was up with its power? Molan was flying through the air, having been caught up in the explosion set off by eclipse. Ha! Molan burst into laughter as he looked up at the dingy sky. Instead of trying to turn his body upright in midair, he spread his arms out wide and just kept laughing like an idiot. Ahaha! Within the feathers of flame that were left floating, lightning struck. With each successive leap through space, the lightning bolt's acceleration increased. Purple embers and sparks lit up the sky. Trailing all of this behind him, Eugene appeared right in front of Molan. Crackergow! Molan's body plummeted to the ground. Chapter 244. The Brave Molan 4. Eclipse condensed Eugene's mana into an ultra-high density mass, then induced an endless chain of explosions within that mass, just like how his ring flame formula worked. The small sun that was created through this method then had the empty sword grafted onto it. As more and more coatings overlapped, the explosions within the center of the sun grew ever more intense. As the explosive force accumulated, the power bound within this sun-shaped spell increased exponentially. As this happened, sunspots would spread across the surface of the false sun, gradually turning it black. The sun turning completely black was the signal that eclipse was also complete and ready to fire. The countless feathers generated by prominence held several different functions. The most important and central feature was their ability to act as coordinates. These coordinates would only respond to Eugene's mana. The leap that Eugene could activate by using this method was much faster than a blink. The single wing of prominence acted as the command tower. The numerous feathers scattered from it responded to prominence's every signal. The moment that he wished for it, Eugene was able to move the scattered feathers wherever he liked. Serving as coordinates was one thing the feathers did, but not the only. They were also acting in place of Eugene's eyes and other senses to observe a certain zone. Even if an opponent was too fast to follow with 2 human eyes, dozens or even hundreds of magic eyes were enough to keep up with pretty much anyone. Even if the enemy numbers were overwhelmingly huge, by casting prominence, Eugene was able to keep an eye on all of them. The reason why various functions had been added to prominence was that these wings, feathers, and the spell itself were thoroughly researched and designed in order to support Eugene's existing combat abilities. On top of that, Eugene's mana itself possessed a certain quality that made it markedly different from ordinary mana. This quality was due to the lightning flames and the spirits of the world tree that were dissolved into the mana. Thanks to these, Eugene's mana was like a single giant organism, and due to this property, Eugene's control and manipulation of his mana was simply outstanding, which made it possible for him to leap at such high speeds. The feathers were essentially just Eugene's mana given form. They were what made the situation in front of Eugene possible. Looking down at Molan, who had been slammed into the ground, Eugene raised his arms. Fwoosh! The feathers that had been scattered by prominence moved according to Eugene's will. As the feathers combined with each other, countless stars were created. No, these weren't exactly stars, but rather miniature suns. Although there was a large difference in power from Eugene's directly casting eclipse through prominence took far less time. Dozens of sunspots. 1. Poured down onto Molan. Molan, who had been buried deep into the ground, didn't even have enough time to pull himself out. Bang bang bang. The whole mountain shook, on the verge of collapsing into crumbles. If it could just end with this, Eugene thought wistfully. Eugene's eyes were peeled wide open as he continued manipulating his mana. Every time that his prominence wing fluttered, feathers were created and shot out into the air, and these feathers immediately clumped together to form more and more sunspots in a never-ending rain. But that alone wasn't enough. Sparks began coalescing between Eugene's raised hands. Instead of continuing this bombardment of sunspots through prominence, Eugene was attempting to create a sunspot through his operation of the white flame formula. But before the sun he had created had a chance to turn black, the mana storm set off by the continuous bombardment disappeared as if it had been washed away by a massive wave. This was because Molan, who had fallen even deeper as the mountain around him collapsed, had gotten back up. Ahaha. Molan's peals of laughter seemed to rock the world. Getting goosebumps, Eugene stopped the formation of the eclipse. He could no longer afford to delay things this way. If he was even a little bit late, he could get caught by that barbaric idiot. Ha ha. Uhaha. Molan continued laughing. He was completely unscathed, but because he had been buried so deeply into the ground, he was covered in dirt. Molan leapt up and swung his fist once more, but unfortunately he was unable to catch even Eugene's shadow. It wouldn't have been strange for anyone in his position to be angry that he hadn't even managed to brush the hem of Eugene's clothes after coming this far, but for some reason Molan was so happy that he couldn't stop himself from laughing. "You really are fast, Hamel," Molan complimented cheerfully. Bang bang. A sunspot exploded right in front of Molan's nose. However, Molan didn't even turn his head or retreat. Instead, he stretched his head out with his hands spread wide open as if he was trying to headbutt the blast. "You're probably not even using ignition currently. If that's the case, does that mean you can go even faster than this?" Molan speculated. Bang bang bang. Explosions erupted one after another. Molan didn't stop. The hundreds and thousands of feathers scattered by prominence served as Eugene's eyes as he watched Molan's body. As Molan's arm muscles swelled and his blood vessels squirmed, Eugene wondered what he was trying to do with this immense strength that threatened to tear his gigantic body apart from the inside out. Eugene checked where Molan's eyes were looking. "It's hard for me to even catch up to you," Molan readily admitted. "Hard. In other words, not impossible." Ever since his childhood, Molan had climbed up and down huge mountains like this and run through the snowfields. Even back when his feet were slow, he had still been able to catch beasts and monsters. Molan's way of hunting was to persistently pursue his prey until he managed to capture it. This man, who once boasted the title of chieftain, was the best hunter among the Buir. No matter how fast his prey's feet were, Molan would still succeed in taking it down. When he set out on a hunt, he was ruthless and knew no fatigue. Of course, given the circumstances and the prey, it was clearly not the time for that sort of hunt. With that, Molan simply gave up on chasing after Eugene. "So I'll catch you without chasing you," Molan warned. The smile disappeared from Molan's face. His wriggling fingers gripped the empty air itself. This wasn't some kind of magic. Whether it was 300 years ago or now, Molan had never learned how to use magic. This wasn't some kind of special gift that Vermouth had granted him along with this mission, like this whole separate space either. This was just a phenomenon infinitely close to magic that was caused by Molan's barbaric and absurd strength. Molan's fingers were actually gripping not the air but space itself. Punching a hole into space wasn't particularly difficult compared to this. If enough force was focused on one point and let loose, it was simple to pierce through space. Yet what Molan was doing now was incomparable to that. Molan's grip moved the entire spatial axis. With force alone, he held this whole space in the palm of his hand, and he was able to pull it wherever he wanted. "This is crazy," Eugene grumbled as an irresistible force wrapped around him. Unfortunately, he simply couldn't think of a suitable way to deal with something like this. No matter how fast Eugene flew, jumped, crawled, or otherwise hastened to move, all of his movements were still taking place within this space. It wasn't just him that was caught, either. Even the fluttering feathers had all frozen in place. Then everything was dragged toward Molan. The giant's strength had become something akin to a law of physics. Just like the pull of gravity, he was pulling everything within his grasp toward himself. At first it was slow, but it slowly grew faster. The pulling force itself didn't change, but it was so strong that it was impossible to escape from it. Naturally, as things approached the source of the force, they only moved faster. Molan didn't move from that spot. He continued to pull the whole space toward him and pointed his fist at Eugene as if he wanted Eugene to clearly see it coming. As for Eugene, he was certain that the fist would fly right at him the moment Molan was certain that he would be unable to avoid it. "You son of a bitch," Eugene spat out a curse as he drove his white flame formula at full force. In response to this, Prominence burst out with light. It was a bit of a pity. This space was on the other side of the Lahanjar. As a result, the mana in the air was scarce, and there were no primal spirits at all. Because of that, he couldn't draw out the full power of Prominence as he had originally planned. "Well, even if I was fighting under the optimal conditions for me, the odds of me winning would have still been slim," Eugene admitted to himself. He thought that it was a shame that some of the paths and methods he could have pursued under normal conditions had been blocked. With that being the case, he had no choice but to use something different. Embers and sparks of electricity began to intertwine between Eugene's fingers. At first, the center of it all was just a little speck of light. But just like how an ember consumed oxygen and grew in size, just like how different electric currents gathered into one and became a huge lightning bolt, the sun held between Eugene's palms began to swell. The eclipse that Eugene slowly fostered this way was simply in a different class when compared to the one that he had used in the darkroom. That wasn't all. The sunspots created from Prominence's feathers also floated around Eugene. Molen hummed in concern. There was no way that Molen would be able to measure the power being readied. His hair floated into the air and twisted like flames. Strength began to be infused into his tightly clenched fist. It was to the point where the same fist, which Eugene had judged earlier as being unavoidable, felt more like a casual greeting. The gap between Eugene and Molo continued to draw ever closer. Now it wouldn't be strange if Molen's fist was swung at any moment. The desire to attack first felt like there was a chimney about to erupt within him, but Eugene desperately suppressed that urge. When the distance between them had narrowed to just the right length, Molen laughed and swung his fist. A fist that looked big enough to cover the entire world approached Eugene. At the same time, Eugene finished preparing the eclipse without any errors. The eclipse thrown forward by Eugene collided with Molen's fist before the blow could land. It must have only been a fleeting moment, but to Eugene's eyes, everything seemed to be going slowly. The enormous power that had been infused into Eclipse was sublimated in an explosion. Molen's fist was able to engulf the entire explosion, but for a moment Molen's fist was pushed back. In that moment, the sunspots that had been floating around as if escorting Eugene were also shot out. Having seized the momentum for the moment, Eugene intended to keep pushing until he finally defeated Molen. Crack crack. Eugene heard a sound. The sound was coming from Molen, from the tips of his fingers to his knuckles, then all the way up his arms and to the torso and the rest of his body. His posture as he was swinging his fist had just shifted slightly. To a viewer it was nothing more than that, a minor shift in stance. Molen had just pushed his foot slightly further forward, shifted his weight onto it and stretched out his muscles. All that he had done was change his posture from a sloppy swing of his fist to a full-fledged punching motion. Changing one's posture, however, meant that the weight behind one's fist would change drastically, and this time was no exception. If Molen had just been swinging his fist forward a moment before, now he had actually taken a proper stance and was throwing a good punch. Eclipse exploded. Then it was wiped away in the blink of an eye. It was undoubtedly a complex and densely bound mass of mana, but it still couldn't withstand Molen's barbaric limitless power. Whoosh. I am going to die. Right as Eugene was about to feel once more that sensation he had felt once before, the fist, which seemed like it was guaranteed to blast his body into tiny pieces, stopped right in front of his nose. The enormous strength was gone in an instant, leaving behind only a breeze that sent Eugene's hair into a flutter. Is this enough, Hamel? Molen said with his fist still outstretched. That idiot, Anise, who was still watching from a distance, cursed as her expression twisted terribly. Eugene didn't say anything and just looked between Molen's fist and Molen's face, which could be seen past it. Because of the emotional shock, the burst of wind and other such reasons, Eugene couldn't even think to close his lips that were parted in a daze. You're strong, Molen complimented him. However, I'm stronger. I am even stronger than I was 300 years ago. So you can't beat me. Eugene was silent. Hamel, I'm not completely sure why you wanted to fight with me. Were you angry because I've changed? Even in the old days you were rough but kind-hearted. Because of that, I think that the reason why you're doing this is for my sake. Eugene remained silent. While I was fighting you, I recalled the memories from my past. It allowed me to ruminate on the mission that was given to me. My hundreds of years spent doing this were meaningful. I was able to reunite with you and Anise. That alone would make me. Hey. Belatedly, Eugene's lips fell shut. His hair, which had been blown back by the wind, slowly settled back down. Eugene placed a hand on his restlessly thumping chest. His head was dizzy and his eyes were throbbing. Still, Eugene forcefully demanded, Are you crazy? Just now Molen had stopped his fist completely. He hadn't even hit Eugene. Had he thought that Eugene would die if the hit landed? Although he knew he was supposed to be grateful for the consideration, Eugene's stomach felt like it was being twisted into knots. Eugene wouldn't have felt like this if Molen had just reduced the power of the blow to the extent where he wouldn't die from it. Indeed, what really truly made Eugene angry was that Molen had completely withdrawn all the strength from his fist. Eugene was weaker than Molen. If Molen wanted to verify this, the method wasn't that difficult. All that Molen needed to do was beat Eugene up until he wasn't able to fight any longer. Eugene had thought that, since his opponent was Molen, that was what was going to happen. No matter who the opponent was, Molen would never sympathize with them. Warriors should always be clearly convinced of their victory or defeat. That was what Molen always said about a fight between warriors. Were you taking it easy on me? If his opponent had been someone else, Eugene wouldn't have been feeling this intensely agitated. It was because his opponent was Molen that Eugene. On me. Eugene repeated. In fact, Eugene wasn't necessarily enraged because this was Molen. Even if they died once and had been reincarnated, it seemed that someone's fundamental nature never changed, and Eugene had always truly hated this sort of thing. Once fists had started flying, even if you couldn't finish the fight, there should at least be nosebleeds, but to actually stop your fist right in front of your foe? What? You're asking if this is enough? You're saying that there's no need to continue? You say that there's no way that I can win. Molen cautiously addressed him. Hamel, you seem to have misunderstood something. Misunderstanding? There wasn't anything to misunderstand about it. Even though he hadn't intended to go this far, Eugene still clutched at his frantically pounding heart. His heart, which had already been throbbing with displeasure, irritation, and anger, began beating even more violently. Anise, who was watching this scene from a distance, let out a deep sigh. Molen also reacted by flinching and taking a step back. There was no way that these two people who had fought together with Hamel 300 years ago couldn't tell what Eugene was doing now. As his fingers massaged his heart, the spinning cores began to run wild. This was ignition. However, it was different from before. Even Eugene himself couldn't begin to guess how much more explosive the ignition of the 6-star white flame formula would be. Hadn't things actually worked out for the better? Usually he wasn't able to pour out all his strength, but if his opponent was Molen, then Eugene wouldn't need to worry about killing him. Purple flames began to swirl around Eugene. The single wing of prominence soared even higher as it grew larger. Molen didn't say anything more and just stood there silently. The flames of Eugene's mana were burning fiercely, but the glow in Eugene's eyes was even more intense than that. Molen belatedly lowered his fist, which had still been outstretched in front of him, but he did not unclench his fists. He laughed, seemingly unaware that he was laughing, then raised his clenched fists back up into a fighting stance. Eugene charged forward, his body so full of strength that it was about to explode. Now that he thought about it, Eugene had made a mistake from the very beginning. Against an idiot like Molen, why had he fought with a skill-oriented battle style that made use of Prominence's spatial leap and the sunspot bombardment? Molen wasn't even skilled at that sort of fight, nor was he foolish enough to have any openings that Eugene could dig into. Therefore, whether it was 300 years ago or now when fighting against Molen, the approach to fighting that he was taking right now was the most suitable. Prominence's feathers all burned up at once. Eugene's body shot forward in a ridiculously fast flash of lightning. Even if it wasn't as complex as that of Eclipse, layers of sword force overlaid with the empty sword covered Eugene's fist. Crackle. Eugene's fist landed on Molen's cheek. The previous attack hadn't been able to move Molen in the slightest, but with ignition activated, Molen's head turned slightly to the side. 2. Molen reflexively spat out some blood from a wound inside of his mouth, then froze for a few moments. How long had it been since he last shed blood? Once he started thinking about this, Molen's head no longer felt cloudy. In fact, he felt the same way he had 300 years ago, and his weary eyes lit up with the same light that they had had in his youth. Molen ground his teeth, which had just tasted blood after so many years, and threw out his fist. This fist was intended to hit Eugene. It didn't miss. Eugene sharpened his concentration to its limit as he prepared to receive Molen's fist. The force behind it wasn't something that he could take head-on. Diverting the flow of an attack was something that Eugene had been good at ever since his previous life, but no matter how good he was at deflecting, a force of this level would still leave his bones tingling. However, I can still take this, Eugene encouraged himself. It didn't go as far as the earlier blow, which had made Eugene feel his impending death. While this blow felt like it would shatter his body if it landed, as long as he didn't get hit by it directly, Eugene could still endure it. And thus the slugfest began. How long had it been since Molen had last swung his fist so vigorously? He hadn't had to punch like this in hundreds of years. The Nur was certainly an ominous existence, but it had never been the kind of opponent that required Molen to give it his all. Just a punch or a swing of his axe, that was all that was needed to kill it. Whenever his lust for battle boiled over, Molen would punch himself in the face. He would scratch the ground and slam his head into it. Yet all of these measures were futile. But now, Molen knew that even now he still couldn't put his full power into the fist that he was swinging. No matter how much he wanted to, Molen couldn't afford to strike his opponent with all his might. No matter how strong Hamel had become after casting Ignition, irreversible consequences would occur if he was forced to face Molen's full power. But strangely enough, Molen's fist felt heavy. Even without pouring all his might into it, his chest didn't feel like it was being constrained. This was because something other than pure strength was being infused into his fist. Within his fist, there was a variety of complex emotions that even Molen himself couldn't fully describe. However, among all these emotions, Molen knew which one was the most important. It was loneliness. His hundreds of years of solitude were being packed into his fist and sent flying at an old friend from a time when he hadn't been so lonely. Their fists continued to swing at each other. Yet even with just that, Molen felt a satisfaction within his chest like never before. Molen snorted. As one blow after another landed on his nose, blood began to spurt. Without wiping away his nosebleed, Molen just smiled. Boom. Molen heard a panting breath. Then Eugene's fist met with his abdomen at full speed. The only effect was that Molen was a little shaken. "What's wrong, Hamel?" Molen shouted in a voice filled with glee. Even though Eugene had accurately aimed for the pit of his stomach, Molen's breathing was fine. However, Eugene's breathing was a mess. His flames, which had burned so intensely at first, had died down to a point even lower than they were at the start. "I can still keep fighting," Eugene stubbornly insisted. Bam. Molen swung his palm and slapped Eugene on the shoulder. This time he was only holding back a bare minimum. Eugene summoned a flame shield, but it was completely shattered, and his bones also couldn't escape the fate of being crushed. With this, Eugene's left arm was no longer usable. "Look out, Hamel," Molen warned Eugene with a chuckle as he raised his fist. Molen's fist fell toward Eugene's head. Eugene was still off balance from his injuries, but he quickly responded to the attack. All of Prominence's feathers moved to cover the top of his head, and he raised his right arm in preparation to block Molen's fist. Crack. The feathers were obliterated and Eugene's right arm was also broken. The rest of the force from the blow that hadn't been dispersed hammered down onto Eugene's body, forcing him to his knees. "I win," Molen gloated. The victory that Molen was currently celebrating was completely different from his previous one. He was laughing sincerely, and he had declared this win with a prideful shout. Eugene was burning up on the inside. He wanted to say something to refute Molen's victory, but unlike earlier, he didn't have any grounds to argue against it. Both of his arms were broken. He had also lost control of his legs. Apart from that, his internal organs were also damaged on top of all his minor fractures. And if that wasn't enough, Ignition was slowly coming to an end. This had been a reckless slugfest. There was no way in hell that Eugene could defeat Molen in one of those. Even in his previous life as Hamel, if he had gotten into a slugfest with Molen, he would have lost every time. "That's right, you son of a bitch," Eugene conceded with a sigh, holding back his anger and the pain coursing through his whole body. "As a 300-year-old, does it feel good to defeat a 21-year-old? Huh. Molen grunted. Eugene repeated himself, but with a curse on top. "I said, does it fucking feel good? I'm not sure what you mean by that, Hamel. You're the one who started the fight, no?" Molen logically pointed out. Eugene just screamed loudly in response. "I asked you if it feels good." Chapter 245. The Brave Molen 5. "If you're asking if it feels good, Molen blinked a few times as he pondered his answer. He was currently feeling a mix of specific emotions, but he wasn't sure how to express them in words. While Molen was lost in such concerns, Anise widened her slitted eyes and glared at Eugene. What a pathetic, shameless, and ugly sight. Mare originally wanted to take Eugene's side, but she couldn't help but empathize passionately with Anissa's words. Who was the one who barged in here of his own accord? It was Eugene. Who was the one who begged for a fight with Molan, even when Molan had said that he didn't want to fight? It was Eugene. Who was the one who got all agitated and decided to restart a fight that was already over? It was Eugene. All of this happened because of Eugene. He had even gone so far as to use ignition only to lose. Having lost so completely, shouldn't Eugene at least keep his mouth shut out of shame or embarrassment? So why on earth was Eugene screaming like he had anything to be proud about? As such, Mare just nodded her head in agreement with Anise. Even Christina slightly agreed with them. Having fallen in love with Eugene ever since the Fount of Light incident, Christina tended to view everything that Eugene did as meaningful, noble, glamorous, and cool. But at this moment she honestly felt that the current Eugene, who was kneeling on the ground with a spurting nosebleed, shouting whether it felt good to win, looked a bit unsightly. Molan continued to hesitate, unable to answer right away. He was slowly coming to understand the true nature of his feelings. Did it feel good? Of course it did. Even if he might be different from his previous life, the opponent was none other than Hamel. It had been fun to fight with Hamel like this, and it was also fun to have been able to defeat him with an overwhelming gap in their strengths, even with Hamel using ignition. However, Molan couldn't just say, it was really fun. Now that the madness had been driven from his head and Molan was able to think clearly, he realized that if he answered positively, the one afflicted with madness this time would be Hamel. During the moment when Molan was hesitating, unable to give an immediate reply, Prominence, which had yet to disappear, burst into flame. Embers of mana ignited in the air around Eugene. Eugene wasn't able to move his limbs as he wished, but if he used his mana in place of his muscles and nerves, it was still possible for him to move like this. With as much speed as he could currently muster, Eugene's body transformed into a flash of lightning. He raised his broken arm and readied a warhead of flames in his fist. Like this, Eugene aimed for Molan's chin, but... Bomb! Their two fists crossed. If both of their arm lengths had been similar, their fight could have ended in a beautiful cross-counter, but there was actually an extreme difference in Eugene and Molan's arm lengths. This meant that Eugene alone was struck by Molan's fist. Fortunately, Molan didn't intend to strike Eugene with his fist, instead only seeking to block Eugene's forward movement. In contrast, Eugene had swung his fist with all his might as he aimed for Molan's chin, but because of the unavoidable difference in their arm lengths, he couldn't even touch Molan. Arg! Eugene choked out a groan. Molan's fist was as large as Eugene's whole skull. As such, rather than looking like he had been blocked by Molan's fist, it looked more like Eugene had slammed into a huge boulder face first. Oh my god, Mare gasped. A surprise attack right as Molan was thinking of a reply. And it didn't even manage to succeed. Eugene's speed just made him slam his face even harder into the counter. Perhaps because Eugene was in such an exhausted state he was too tired to even dodge it. Eugene fell back, his nosebleed spewing blood like a fountain. Seeing his miserable appearance, Mare unconsciously let out a deep sigh. How ugly. Thankfully, Eugene wasn't able to hear Mare's regretful sigh. This was because the moment his head fell backward, the lights turned off in Eugene's head and he fell unconscious. How long had he been out? Eugene finally came to his senses, but he wasn't able to open his eyes right away. This was because the things that had happened right before he fainted were messily playing out inside his head. The blood had gotten to his head and he had lost control. Now that his agitation had subsided, Eugene clearly realized just how ugly his behavior had been. Eugene silently writhed in shame. He was afraid of what kind of teasing and stares awaited him when he opened his eyes. But that wasn't the only reason he couldn't open his eyes. His eyelids were simply too heavy. His body didn't have any strength and it really hurt. He literally couldn't lift a single finger. I know that you've regained consciousness. So why are you still pretending to be asleep? A devil's whisper tickled his ears. Eugene tried not to react to it. However, the devil wouldn't allow Eugene to just ignore her. Poke. The devil's finger gently pressed down on Eugene's pectoral muscles. Eugene groaned. Gag. Eugene usually was quite skilled at overcoming pain. However, right now he wasn't in a situation where he especially needed to endure pain, and her fingertips were able to accurately pinpoint the places where his muscles had ruptured and poked down into the sensitive inner layers and were far too merciless. Open your eyes, Anise instructed, her usually slitted eyes opened wide as she stared down at Eugene. Seeing Eugene like this, with his forehead furrowed to its limits, as he let out a groan from between tightly clenched teeth, Anise felt a kind of exhilarating ecstasy. Eugene eked out a growl. You? No way, Hamel. Did you really expect me to have completely treated your body while you were comfortably passed out? Anise sarcastically scoffed. That was what Eugene had been hoping for. However, currently if he answered in the affirmative, Anise would surely have scolded him. As such, Eugene could only spit out the right thing to say in this sort of situation. I'm sorry. Usually, Anise's anger couldn't be resolved with just a single apology. However, the current Anise wasn't really all that angry. Hamel's body had already paid the full price for going on a rampage on his own. Also, Hamel's action had been for Molin's sake. Anise caved in. Where would you like me to treat you first? Anise had fallen in love with Hamel's kindness. She might have felt a thrill of excitement at seeing him in pain, but in addition to that she had also felt some heartache. With a bright grin, Anise tilted her head closer to Eugene. Tell me directly with your own lips, Hamel. Where is the most painful area on your body? What type of pain do you want me to help you with first? Anise asked excitedly. Could you start by putting away the finger poking my chest? Eugene ground out. She had completely forgotten. Anise quickly removed her finger and wiped away her embarrassed expression. She had asked him where it hurt the most, but that was a tricky question to answer for the current Eugene. It felt like he had more broken bones than unbroken bones. All his muscles were torn and even his internal organs had been damaged. It wouldn't be strange if he had died from this, but the fact that he hadn't died was all because Anise wouldn't allow Eugene to die. If she was going to prolong my suffering, she should have at least treated me. Like I've always thought, she has a terrible personality, Eugene silently complained before requesting, do something about my insides first. Your insides? Anise questioned. I'm talking about my internal organs, Eugene clarified. Whether they're in the chest or the stomach. Anise seemed embarrassed. By those words, Hamel, are you asking me to take a good look deep within you? Eugene gaped in confusion. Anise scolded him. What a shameless and vulgar person. What in the world was Anise even talking about? Eugene absolutely couldn't understand what was going on inside Anise's head. As Anise's cheeks flushed red, she carefully caressed Eugene's body. The one currently taking the lead to examine Eugene's body wasn't Anise but Christina. Anise hadn't forgotten the promise that she had made to Christina earlier. With the light infused into her fingertips, Christina carefully ran her fingers over Eugene's pectoral muscles. The shredded and torn muscle fibers began to heal. Christina coughed. Ahem. Where would you like to be treated next? Why did Anise change places with you? Eugene inquired. Christina gasped in surprise. Was there really that much of a difference in the way that they spoke? Christina turned to look at Eugene with a startled expression. Eugene answered her unspoken question. There's a difference in your touch. Really? Christina asked doubtfully. It's hard to explain exactly, but it's similar to someone's aura, Eugene attempted to explain. Your touch and Anise's are different. Your body may be the same, but there's something about the way you move your fingers. The truth was, Eugene hadn't received much treatment from Christina, not enough to remember each and every detail of her touch. However, he definitely remembered what Anise's touch felt like. Even though they shared the same body while only their consciousness swapped, Eugene could immediately tell the difference between Christina and Anise whenever they did so. Eugene said all this with a casual expression as if it wasn't anything much, but these nonchalant words of his caused the innocent Christina's heart to pound. This was because it felt like Eugene was validating who she was as Christina Rogerus. Eugene returned to the main topic. So why have you two swapped places? Wasn't Anise the one healing me? Christina faltered. That is. Eugene suddenly realized something. Is this some kind of test of your divine magic? Like I've always said, Anise also has quite a nasty personality. Why does she have to treat me as a test subject at a time like this? Ahem. We can't always leave your treatment up to Lady Anise, Sir Eugene. Just like Lady Anise, I too am a saint. As such, I need to get familiar with taking care of your wounds. As she finished giving an explanation that she herself knew was complete nonsense, Christina began treating Eugene's wounds. His cloak, which had been lying on the floor, began to crawl over to Eugene. Once the cloak was stuck to his side, Mare poked her head out of it. Eugene wasn't able to understand why the glare that Mare had in her eyes as she looked at him felt so cold. Even so, as if it was only natural, Mare rested her chin on Eugene's stomach so that he could stroke Mare's hair with his trembling fingers. "Please stay still. The treatment for your hands isn't finished yet," Anise, who had swapped with Christina, instructed. As Anise's hand was enveloped in light, Eugene's broken bones glued themselves together, and his torn muscles and nerves were reconnected. Eugene twisted Mare's hair into coils with his now much more comfortable hand. "Where has Molin gone off to?" Eugene belatedly asked. Although he didn't know how long he had been unconscious, Eugene felt like not too long had passed. They hadn't even left this space yet. They were still on the other side of Lahanjar. "He's left to catch the Nur," Anise replied. Eugene gave a surprised, "What?" Anise explained, "Before you woke up, Nur seemingly reappeared on the outside." "Is that so?" Eugene replied in a low voice. Anise blinked at this muted response. She then put on an ill-natured smile as she leaned her head over Eugene. "Aren't you worried about Molin? That idiot might have lost his mind again after catching the Nur, so he might be out there somewhere, causing harm to himself." Eugene scoffed. "If it was earlier, I would be worried. I'd have also said something to you as well, asking why you allowed Molin to go on his own and why you didn't go with him. However, there's no longer any need for that now." There wasn't a single speck of doubt or worry in the words that Eugene had just uttered. He had said it all drilly as if he was only stating the very obvious. Though their brawl hadn't lasted very long, by crossing fists with Molin's barbarically limitless strength, Eugene had gotten a feel of Molin. Boom! The ground started rocking up and down. Molin had fallen from the sky, holding the carcass of a huge wild boar over his head. Although the monster was already dead, Eugene could instinctively sense that that wasn't just some huge beast, monster, or demonic beast. Eek! Mare's shoulders trembled in fright and she fled back into the cloak. Eugene wrapped the cloak around his body, and while barely being able to raise his head off of the ground, he stared at Molin. Molin, who was holding a Nur the size of an entire house with just one hand, bared his row of shining teeth in a smile as he met Eugene's gaze. "Hamel!" Molin greeted him. "You've woken up." There was none of the madness that Molin had shown when he had decapitated the Nur in the Great Hammer Canyon or when they had seen him smashing his head against the ground. Molin continued speaking. "Anise said that you would be okay, but I was truly worried. After all, the wounds you had when you fainted were so terrible." "Those were all your fault," Eugene complained. "My fault? You're wrong, Hamel. You're the one who attacked me even though I didn't want to fight," Molin corrected him. Although this was the undeniable truth, Eugene still wanted to refute him somehow. While chewing on his bottom lip, Eugene thought about what he could say in response. However, no matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't think of anything other than resorting to personal attacks. Just as Eugene was about to seriously consider choosing his swear words, Molin grinned and called out to him, "Hamel, I'm going to get rid of this corpse up there. Would you like to go with me?" Eugene grunted. "Huh?" He hadn't expected that Molin would say such a thing first. As such, Eugene honestly let out a noise of surprise. After staring at Molin for a few moments, Eugene smirked and nodded his head. "Of course I want to go with you, but right now my body isn't moving the way I want it to," said Eugene. Although she had already healed all of his injuries, even Anise's divine magic couldn't take care of Ignition's recoil as well. As such, Eugene currently wasn't able to move his body as he pleased. Naturally, Molin was also aware of Ignition's recoil. "In that case, I'll just have to give you a hand like I did in the past," Molin proposed as he tossed the gigantic Nur all the way to the mountain's peak. Watching as the Nur's corpse flew into the distance, Eugene gaped for a few moments before finally asking, "If you can just throw them like that, why do you insist on carrying the corpse all the way up to the peak?" "No real reason. Usually I'm not in my right mind, so I just throw them away wherever. Whenever I start thinking there are too many of them, I just collapse the mountain on top of that. If I do that, then everything becomes neat and tidy in no time," Molin explained with a chuckle as he gestured to their surroundings in explanation. Due to the fight between Eugene and Molin, the whole mountain had seemingly collapsed, but now there weren't any traces of their battle left. There still wasn't any snow, But the bizarre scenery that had reminded them of their time in the Devildom those hundreds of years ago had also changed to a rather ordinary-looking scenery of a regular mountain. This was because the mountain that had previously been eroded by the miasma had collapsed and had been remade anew. "Well then, let's go together," Molan declared with a cheerful expression. It seemed like there weren't any traces of his previous insanity left in his heart. However, they didn't know if or when Molan's heart might be corrupted with madness once more. Something that already collapsed once could one day collapse again. But for now at least it didn't seem like it would collapse. Molan pulled Eugene up and supported him. Then he also extended an arm to Anise. Anise grinned and clung onto Molan's arm. Molan's feet kicked off the ground. In a single leap they flew up high into the sky. Eugene and Anise gazed down below as they clung to Molan's arms. What they saw was the enclosed scenery of a mountain. This was the other side of the Lihanjar. The mountain where Eugene had just been had collapsed and had been restored, so it looked like an ordinary mountain, but the rest of the scenery hadn't undergone the same process. Their environments were still similar to the Devildom. The corpses of the Nur could be seen here and there. Traces of Molan's self-harm could also be seen. "There it is," Molan whispered. Eugene and Anise raised their heads. They had already climbed higher than the peak of the mountain. In the north they could see Roguyaran, the end of the world. The landscape they could see from here should be different from what they would see outside. However, Eugene could comprehend why the Roguyaran he could see from here was called the land that should not be crossed and the end of the world. There really was nothing there. All there was gray land, gray skies and gray air. Everything was gray and empty. However, it wasn't actually empty here. At the base of the mountain, in the outskirts connected to the Roguyaran, countless corpses of Nur had been piled up there. "In the past I always threw the Nur's corpse over there," Molan explained. Boom. Molan's feet landed on the ground. He put Anise and Eugene down for the moment, then picked up the boar-type Nur that he had thrown here earlier. "I don't know where the Nur come from. I don't even know what the Nur are. However, Vermouth said that the Nur come from the end. Because of that, I thought the deceased Nur should also be thrown back to the end," Molan further elaborated. The Nur's corpse flew into the sky. The huge corpse flew over several mountain peaks and fell into the Roguyaran. Molan said absent-mindedly, "At some point I just stopped doing this." Anise was supporting Eugene. Without looking back at them, Molan just stared into the Roguyaran. "Hamel. Anise. I hated coming to the peak for this moment. At some point I became afraid of climbing up to this peak. I didn't want to see Roguyaran. The Roguyaran that can be seen from here is different from the Roguyaran that can be seen outside. But in some places it's the same. I didn't want to see Roguyaran. I didn't want to see the end," Molan confessed. "Molan," Eugene called out. Molan continued speaking, "I might be strong but I was lonely. The years have weakened my warrior's spirit. However, Hamel, it's fine now. You didn't tell me your reasons for it in detail, but from your fist I felt that it was for my sake." "That fight doesn't count," Eugene suddenly spat out, cutting Molan's words short. "Just think back to 300 years ago, Molan. You had an exceptional physique, so you were also skilled in barehanded fighting, but I honestly wasn't that skilled with my bare fists. So even when we were both in our primes, if we had only fought with our fists, I still wouldn't have been able to beat you." He needed to acknowledge what couldn't be denied. As such, Eugene continued speaking quickly. He had no intention of giving Molan any room for rebuttal. "However, what do you think would happen if I had a real weapon in my hands? Starting from my previous life, I've always been an expert in all kinds of weapons. There's no comparison between me fighting with a weapon and me fighting with my bare hands. So which do you think is the real me? It's only when I'm holding a weapon that I'm really fighting seriously. Especially since I currently have the Holy Sword, the Moonlight Sword, the Demonic Spear and the Annihilation Hammer. I also have Vermouth's Storm Sword, Devouring Sword, Thunderbolt Pernoa and the Dragon's Spear. It's only when I'm able to use all of them that you can see my real skills. Although you might be able to show your skills off with just a single crude axe, I can't show my real skills without the right weapon." It wasn't a lie. If I had just a single crudely made knife in my hand, the outcome wouldn't have been so obvious. After all, facing your barbaric fists with just my bare body and parrying them with a sword would place completely different burdens on me. With my refined techniques, I would have been able to divert all of your attacks without even damaging the edge of my blade, and in the end I would have been able to slice open your body. You understand what I'm trying to say, right? Our fight just now wasn't fair. I haven't really lost to you. So that fight doesn't coup. That's not true, Hamel, Molen replied with a rarely seen serious expression.